Beneath the wind-swept dunes of Algeria, beneath its battered cities, forgotten kingdoms, and fractured tongues, there lies something no conqueror could erase. Not the Romans, not the Arabs, not even the firestorm of colonial war that would shake the 20th century. Because while names, languages, and empires have risen and vanished, one thing remained unchanged: the code buried inside every Algerian cell. We rarely ask what stories a genome might tell, and even less, whose voices are woven into its silence. But Algeria's DNA, it is not quiet. It is screaming, whispering Paleolithic echoes, hiding traces of women who crossed seas before history began, holding the bloodline of ancient hunters who walked where the desert is now a graveyard of salt. And the more we look, the more disturbing the truth becomes. We never really understood who Algerians are. Thousands of years ago, long before the word Algeria was spoken, even before the Berbers carved their identity into the North African soil, a people thrived here under a different sun. They left behind no grand cities, no alphabets, no standing monuments, only stones shaped by their hands and DNA shaped by their survival. They were the Aterians, modern humans with a blade technology so advanced it rivals anything their European contemporaries created. And they were here, in the Maghreb, 90,000 years ago. From them rose the Ibero-Mauritians, the bearers of back bladelets and ornaments made from seashells, proof that even in the Paleolithic, Algeria was not isolated. It was coastal, connected, and surprisingly cosmopolitan. Their traces were found in Tafrelt, Morocco, and the DNA extracted from their bones sent a shockwave through the scientific world. It was European, North African, and Sub-Saharan, all at once. And that's where the mystery begins. Because modern Algerian DNA still carries those threads, not just as fragments, but as dominant lineages. Two mitochondrial haplogroups, U6 and M1, stand out. U6, found at nearly 12% in Algeria, is a maternal signature so old it predates the Sahara as we know it. Its origin lies in the Middle East, but it returned to Africa in the Paleolithic, long before the rise of agriculture. Once in the Maghreb, it flourished, diverged, and settled into the very fabric of Algerian identity. A wandering ghost that came home, long before the concept of home existed. M1, its genetic sibling, peaked in northeastern Africa. But in Algeria, it rises to 7%, forming a genetic spike that interrupts its usual northeast to northwest decline. Scientists don't fully understand why, but its presence in Algeria is so distinct. It breaks expected migratory patterns. It suggests a very different story, one of local Paleolithic expansion, not just diffusion from elsewhere. In these lineages, we're not seeing empires. We're not seeing conquest. We're seeing the people who stayed, the women whose descendants are still here, whose bones may lie unmarked in the Oran Mountains or beneath the white dust of the Tel Atlas. But even in this ancient clarity, there is disruption. Some of the U6 lineages found in Algeria are not ancestral, they are derived. Subgroups like U6A123, found at much higher frequencies than in Mauritania or Egypt, tell us that something happened within Algeria, an internal diversification, a hidden center of evolution. U6 didn't just pass through Algeria, it transformed there. These mitochondrial threads, passed from mother to child, unchanged for tens of thousands of years, are not just markers of migration. They're signatures of survival, of women who endured climate catastrophe, shifting ecologies, invasions, and enslavement, and whose genes, silently, still live in millions today. And yet, this is only the beginning. Because Algeria's DNA doesn't stop at Africa. Its genetic past reaches northward, across the sea, into Europe, and what we find there unravels everything we thought we knew about Maghrebi history. But to understand that crossing, and the women who made it, we have to step into the waves of the prehistoric Mediterranean, and ask, how much of Europe is buried in Africa, and how much of Africa quietly lives in European bloodlines? The Mediterranean has long been called a sea that connects, a blue corridor of empires and exchange. But what if we've misunderstood its oldest role? Not as a highway for civilization, but as a mirror, one in which Europe and North Africa reflect back into each other, genetically, silently, again and again. In Algerian DNA, that mirror comes to life. Because within the maternal bloodlines of Algeria lie three unmistakably European signals: H1, H3, and HV0, mitochondrial haplogroups that dominate the post-glacial genetic landscape of Western Europe. H1 alone accounts for nearly 48% of Algerian H lineages, not as a trace, not as a relic, but as a core component of the maternal population. To the untrained eye, this seems impossible. How could European maternal DNA flow so deeply, so permanently, into the heart of North Africa? The answer lies not in conquest, but in migration by sea, during times long before recorded history. A time when the ice retreated, coasts opened, and seafaring became survival. Post-glacial Europe saw waves of expansion, driven by warming climates and retreating glaciers. Human populations pushed outward, not just inland, but outward across the Mediterranean. And while the narrative of Neolithic farmers moving from the Near East into Europe is well established, this is something different. A west-to-south pulse, an overlooked migration from the Iberian Peninsula into the Maghreb. This isn't theory. It's written into the Algerian maternal genome. H1, H3, and HV0, all highly concentrated in Iberia, are found in Algeria at levels that match, or even surpass, those of many southern European regions. It is not random. It is not drift. It is evidence of a forgotten era of maritime contact, of women crossing oceans, settling permanently, and shaping the future. But the story gets stranger, because when we look at the Y chromosome, the paternal lineage, we find their male counterparts. Lineages like R, M412, R, S116, R, U152, and R, M529, all derived from the dominant European R1b haplogroup, appear in Algeria in statistically significant frequencies. These are not North African in origin. They are Western European, and their presence in the male Algerian population mirrors the maternal evidence with chilling symmetry. The implications? A two-way exchange. Not conquerors, not slaves, but likely migrants, entire communities moving across the water. A time when the Mediterranean wasn't a border, it was a lifeline. But the symmetry doesn't hold perfectly. In fact, when we map the direction and scale of gene flow, a subtle pattern emerges, one that speaks to human behavior more than genetics. Female-mediated gene flow from Europe into Algeria is stronger than the male, and male-mediated flow from Algeria into Europe, especially via autochthonous North African Y-DNA lineages like EM81, is present in southern Europe at a stable, measurable level. In fact, EM81, native to North Africa, appears in up to 2% of Iberian males today. It's as if the sea recorded a silent dialogue of gendered migration. Women arriving from Europe, men sailing northward, possibly through trade, warfare, or exile. But Algeria didn't just absorb Europe. It reflected it back. So what happens when both shores carry the same genetic signatures? When ancient lineages like H1 or R1b appear on either side of the Mediterranean, almost indistinguishably, we lose the illusion of separation. We begin to understand that North Africa and Southern Europe are not opposites. They are siblings, separated by time, not essence. This has staggering implications for how we think about identity, migration, and the colonial narratives that divided Europe from Africa. The blood doesn't lie, and the blood says, we were never that far apart. But Algeria's story doesn't stop with Europe, because just as pale-skinned lineages drifted southward, darker, older echoes moved in from the south, not across seas, but through the silent, punishing sands of the Sahara. And in those lineages, Algeria carries something far heavier than migration. It carries memory. In the 7th century, an empire came with the Quran in one hand and the sword in the other. The Arab Islamic expansion swept across North Africa in waves, first a whisper, then a firestorm. Cities fell, dialects vanished, and the once mountainous shield of Berber identity began to erode beneath the tide of Islamization. Today, Algeria is officially Arab. Its official language is Arabic. Its political and religious roots trace to Mecca, Medina, Damascus. But Algeria's DNA tells a different story, and it begins with a paradox. One of the most dominant paternal lineages in Algeria is JM267, a Y chromosome haplogroup with clear origins in the Levant and Arabian Peninsula. Its frequency spikes in urban populations and cosmopolitan samples. It is, without doubt, the genetic echo of Arab expansion. And yet, when we look at the maternal side, at the empty DNA of Algerian women, we see almost no trace of an Arab demographic wave. Instead, we see something hauntingly consistent. Haplogroups like U6, H1, H3, and M1 dominate, lineages that predate the Arab conquests by tens of thousands of years. The women of Algeria, genetically speaking, never left. The conclusion is both simple and revolutionary. Arabization was not a replacement. It was an overlay, a cultural and linguistic conversion, not a demographic one. The indigenous women stayed. Their daughters stayed. The names of gods changed. The tongues changed. But in the mitochondria, in the code passed only from mother to child, the Berber past survived untouched. This is not an anomaly. It's a pattern. Studies across North Africa show the same dynamic. A heavy male-biased input from Arabia, often tied to the expansion of Islam, and the subsequent assimilation of local women into new cultural identities. But genetically, they remained who they were. Algerian Y-DNA shows a clear uptick in JM267 and related markers during the Islamic period. And within that, specific haplotypes suggest localized implantation, clusters that have evolved uniquely inside Algeria, rather than being constantly renewed from outside. This suggests that even the Arab male lineage, over time, was absorbed, becoming Algerian in form, not just in name. But the mitochondria held steady. U6, M1, H1. These women carried not only their children, but their ancient identity. This asymmetry, the dominance of Arab paternal genes versus the resilience of Berber maternal lines, reveals more than just migration. It reveals the human face of empire, because the Arabization of Algeria, like much of North Africa, was not done through mass colonization. It was done through sedentarization, through intermarriage, through centuries of cultural reinforcement rather than demographic extinction. The sword may have carved the law, but the cradle preserved the blood. And in Algeria, that preservation runs deep. Even among Arab-identifying Algerians today, the majority of maternal ancestry still traces back to prehistoric North Africa. Beneath the Quranic verses and Arab surnames lies the same mitochondrial inheritance that once endured the last glacial maximum, the Neolithic Revolution, and the fall of Rome. But why does this matter? Because nations build myths. And Algeria, like many post-colonial societies, has often been forced to choose between Arab and Berber, between East and West, as if its identity must be singular, pure, and linear. The DNA refuses. The genome tells a story of layered survival, of women who endured, of languages that faded, but legacies that did not. It speaks not in flags or empires, but in base pairs, cold, objective, inescapable. And it leads us to a question few dare ask in the public square. If your body remembers a time before language, before conquest, then who are you really? But Algeria's genome does not just carry the memory of Arab expansion. It also holds something older, darker, something that entered not through language or faith, but through chains and desert winds. Next, we descend into the silent corridors of genetic memory, where Africa meets itself, and the forgotten voices of the enslaved speak through blood alone. There are parts of history that never reach the page, stories too painful to be preserved in words, names that were never recorded, only whispered. And in Algeria, some of the loudest voices in its genetic story are the ones never allowed to speak. We find them not in monuments, not in royal lineages or empires, but in mitochondrial strands and Y-chromosome anomalies, in mismatched percentages, in patterns too consistent to be accidental. They are the sub-Saharan lineages, the genetic shadows of a long, buried trauma. In modern Algerian DNA, around 20% of maternal haplogroups trace their roots to sub-Saharan Africa. They come from the West, lineages like L2A1, L3B, L1B, and L3D, and from the Central Forests, bearing the signature of groups like L1C, L3E, and L3F. A smaller but still present trace leads back to the Horn of Africa, through L0 and other rare haplogroups. But here's the haunting part. The paternal Y chromosome data tells a different story. Sub-Saharan African Y-DNA accounts for only 10% of Algerian lineages, half the maternal proportion. It's not a random split. It's a gendered scar. Because this isn't about ancient migration alone. This is about the trans-Saharan slave trade, a system so vast, so systematic, and so enduring that it altered the very structure of Algerian ancestry. For over 1,000 years, a quiet, brutal network ferried human lives across the Sahara. Long before the Atlantic slave trade began, caravans from Timbuktu, Kano, and the Sahel moved captives northward, into cities like Tlemcen, Algiers, and Oran. The trade was fueled not just by demand for labor, but for concubinage, household servitude, and courtly prestige. And the victims? Overwhelmingly female. The genetic consequence is chilling. Women from sub-Saharan Africa were brought into Algerian society and assimilated. Their identities erased, their descendants absorbed. Their Y chromosomes disappeared with their male kin, who were often castrated or excluded from reproduction. But their mitochondria remained, passed down, generation after generation. This is why, across the Maghreb, the female sub-Saharan genetic signal is consistently stronger than the male, and why it appears even in populations that claim no African ancestry at all. It's not visible. It's not talked about. But it's there. Algeria, like much of North Africa, inherited this asymmetry. In the genome, it lives on, as unbalanced echoes, as a quiet reminder of a human system that left no written monument, no public mourning, and no names. Only code. When scientists mapped the exact frequencies, they found something astonishing. While Algeria's maternal sub-Saharan lineages sit near 20%, its Central African contribution is modest, around 5%. The majority comes from West Africa, from regions once rich in gold, empire, and resistance, now remembered primarily for their captivity. Even more chilling is the match between these genetic inputs and the historical slave trade routes. The genes trace the caravans. The DNA aligns with the old paths, from the Sahel into Tamanrasset, then into the northern cities, like wounds left open and healing in silence. And yet, these women remained. They raised families. They blended into communities. They are now invisible, not because they are gone, but because their identities were erased by history, by social pressure, by the very structure of inheritance. Their descendants may speak Arabic, bear Amazigh surnames, follow Islam, were the national colors of Algeria. But their maternal DNA tells the truth, a truth never taught in schools, a truth many still fear to say aloud. So what do we do with this truth? We confront it. We honor it. We understand that genetics is not just about ancestry percentages. It's about acknowledging the lives behind those markers. Women who were stripped of homeland, name, and story, and yet persisted in the only way possible, through their children. Their story is not just African. It's Algerian. It's human. And it must be told. But Algeria's DNA story is not finished. Because alongside these deep-rooted maternal echoes and male-driven invasions, there's something else, something stranger. A botanical clue. A genetic divide not only in humans, but in trees. A line that splits Algeria from Morocco, and even from itself, and may reveal a deeper, older fracture in the land's very soul. Sometimes, to see the truth about a nation, you have to look beyond its people. You have to listen to its trees. In the arid mountain ranges of the Ouras, a small and ancient tree clings to life. Juniperus thurifera, the thuriferous juniper. It's what has burned in North African hearths for millennia. Its seeds, most of them now empty, carry not just pollen but prophecy. And like the humans who walk beneath its branches, it too carries genetic memory. When scientists examine these trees, carefully extracting DNA from their leaves, from weather-worn bark, they expected to see normal variation. Instead, they found something astonishing. The juniper trees of Algeria are genetically distinct from their Moroccan cousins. So distinct, in fact, that they may deserve a separate subspecies classification. Their closest relatives are not across the border, but across the sea, in the mountains of Europe. This east-west split mirrors exactly what we now see in the human populations of the Maghreb. Algerians are genetically distinct from Moroccans. Moroccans are distinct from Tunisians. The tree rings do not lie. The landscape itself is fractured along an ancient axis. An axis older than borders, older than Islam, older than Rome. It is a biogeographic memory, a reminder that the Maghreb was never a monolith. And the mystery deepens. The genetic breaks in trees are paralleled by mammals, birds, even insects. Multiple studies, from home oaks to freshwater fish, reveal a shared genetic phenomenon. The Maghreb is not one continuous band of biodiversity, but a patchwork, a mosaic of disconnected microzones, shaped by mountains, climate shifts, and prehistoric migration corridors. In humans, the echoes are the same. Algeria's Oran region carries one pattern. The Ouras Mountains carry another. The Mozabites of the Mzab Valley, a Berber-speaking enclave, carry yet another. Within one modern nation, multiple ancient genetic identities coexist, often invisible to the eye, but mapped clearly in haplogroup frequencies, in FST values, in clustering algorithms that don't lie. Even Algerian mtDNA shows internal microdifferentiation, regional substructures that suggest isolated lineages evolving separately, divided not just by space, but by thousands of years of social, ecological, and climatic separation. So what is Algeria then? Not a single people, not a single story, but a palimpsest, a layered manuscript written over and over, never quite erased. A genome built from prehistoric reindeer hunters, from Neolithic farmers, from Mediterranean sailors, Arab warriors, sub-Saharan survivors, and more. A country divided, but not broken. And maybe that's the deeper truth behind Algerian identity. That to be Algerian is not to belong to a single root, but to a forest. A convergence of timelines, origins, and migrations that share the same soil, but grow in different directions. In the DNA of people, and in the tree rings of juniper, Algeria whispers the same thing. I am not one. I am many. And I have always been here. Now, with this forest of ancestry laid bare, only one question remains. What do we do with a story this complex? How do we carry it in a world that demands simple labels? Next, we close this journey, but not with a conclusion, with a reflection and a challenge. What remains when the names change? When the borders shift, when the colonizers come and go, when languages fade and religions replace one another, what's left? For Algeria, the answer is simple. The DNA. It remained. Through ice ages and Islamic empires. Through Phoenician trade, Roman occupation, and Arab conquest. Through the Ottoman cannon fire and the long, bitter shadow of French colonization. Through exile, resistance, and revolution. It remained. Today, Algeria stands as a sovereign nation. But beneath that political identity is a genetic continent. A convergence zone of 5 major ancestries, North African, Middle Eastern, European, and both East and West Sub-Saharan African. There's no single origin story here. And maybe that's the point, because Algeria's genome is not a story of purity. It's a story of persistence, a resistance not fought with rifles, but with the silent fidelity of inheritance. Every time a Berber woman passed her mtDNA to her child, she defied erasure. Every European haplogroup that crossed the sea and stayed, every sub-Saharan lineage that survived forced assimilation, every Levantine thread woven into the paternal tapestry. These are the real chapters of Algerian history. Not myths, not flags, but lives. And now, that history is rising from the soil, from universities in Algiers and Paris, to the sequencing labs in Spain and Italy. Scientists are peeling back the layers. They're finding what was hidden, correcting what was erased, and illuminating what was never truly lost. So what does this mean for identity? It means that to be Algerian is to carry contradiction, and to carry it proudly. To know that your body may contain genes from Andalusian refugees, from West African queens, from Jewish Berbers, from Neolithic farmers, or Paleolithic fishers who walked the Mediterranean coast when the world was still young. It means that history is not behind you. It is inside you. And now we turn the mirror. What about you? Where do your stories come from? The ones you know, and the ones your blood has never spoken aloud. Have you ever wondered what lies beneath your last name, your accent, your passport? Because the genome does not forget. It waits, patiently, quietly, until we ask. So tell us, who are you really? Have you had your DNA tested? Did it surprise you? Did it make you question anything you were told about who you are? Drop your story in the comments. Share this with someone who thinks they know where they come from. Let's give voice to the forgotten, to the mixed, to the miscategorized, to the millions whose ancestry defies neat borders. If this story moved you, like, comment, subscribe, because there are more stories like this, waiting to be told. And they won't be found in textbooks. They'll be found in blood,